so many of the astronauts, early astronauts, had a revelation or a change in perspective, or, they felt closer to God, whatever. I didn't feel any of that because the way I explain it is I don't need to leave the earth to sense that. I look around at this earth and I go, wow, this place is a beautiful part of the universe. You think about a tree and, well, no, wait a minute. How does the water go up the root, up the trunk, combine with chlorophyll in the leaf and take the sun's energy to make life and make molecules that change? How can this be? And you think about the number of cells you have in your body and the DNA and the brain and how it works. And it's like, man, this is a wonderful universe created by God. And I don't need to leave Earth to sense that. But I don't want to, I want to tell you, it's just an amazing scene. And I wish everybody could see what the Earth looks like from space.
Jim, as the first astronaut on the show, welcome to Discover More.
Thank you very much, Benoit. Good to see you again.
So let's get into the meats and potatoes of your topical expertise. What is the difference between controlling risk and managing risk?
So thank you for having me on. It was a dream of mine to be an astronaut. Most companies, in fact, most people understand the concept of managing risk, which most companies do very well, where they assess the risk in the organization. They decide to allocate funds to reduce or mitigate the risk. What I find is much more important, though, to the operators, the people who are on the front lines, who are facing the hazards. They don't think about managing risk. They actually think about controlling risk. They do things to make sure they are not the ones that have the broken leg or the injury. So it's the techniques that they use to control risk are much different than what the organization does to manage risk.
I like going to the semantics and the context of words on this show, since context and definition can get hijacked often and distorted. I think the word control, to me at least, implies this underlying illusion of control, this fallacy that we can exert our will over the flow of life in certain situations. Any thoughts there?
As an operator, I have to believe that I can control risk. Now, in your expertise, the way the brain works, am I really controlling the situation? I say yes. If I'm in an airplane and my hands are on the controls, I am physically controlling the outcome of the mission. Now, I try to control my brain processes to make sure that I'm doing the things that I really want to be doing and I'm assessing the situation. So I tend to think of it in a very practical sense. If I'm a surgeon and I'm opening up somebody's heart to do chest to do open heart surgery, I really want to make sure that I'm controlling the situation, not allowing the environment to control me.
I think the undercurrents of that is a sense of confidence, right? Whether you're operator in the surgical room or operator like yourself, commanding flights, space shuttles, anything in between, we have to be confident about our skill sets. But then how do we parse through this era of overconfidence, delusions, distorted thinking? Like, where is a fine balance in that?
So this is one of my favorite topics, Benoit. One of the most important techniques, I call it balance confidence with humility. You can't have, if you don't have confidence, you can't climb on a rocket and you'll make mistakes. If you don't have humility, you won't realize you're making mistakes, and that can be deadly. So you have to have both. You have to have supreme confidence, but you better have the humility to say, hey, I might not be doing this correctly. I better double check what I'm doing and make sure that I'm doing the right things.
The best definition I've heard about confidence is when you're reviewing the patterns and archives of the past, there's undeniable amount of evidence to support whatever you're about to do. That's confidence based on patterns and evidence that's being established.
Yeah. And of course, in our world, preparation or training is key. I think I still have the record for most time in the simulator of any astronaut. And that gives you the confidence when you climb on the rocket just before liftoff. to be supremely confident that we are the best trained crew on the planet about ready to execute this dangerous mission. If you don't have that training and preparation and you begin to lose the confidence, I mean, everything goes bad in a hurry.
I love when you said the perfect recipe is supreme confidence plus humility, because humility is what allows us to be receptive towards people's feedback, culturally speaking. I do want to go into some brain functioning and decision making, which I know is also your expertise. Jim, from your, 35 plus years of experiences in high stakes situations, 20 years in NASA, what is the role of cognitive biases in our decision making, especially in these high stress and high stake environments?
Critically important. And by the way, thanks for saying that you consider me an expert. I think you are the expert because you have the academic background and the practical experience working with people. I have a lot of practical experience of analyzing my brain processes and putting that together with experience and making mistakes and trying to make sure the consequence of the mistakes is minor and able to be mitigated. And then you learn from it. And when I started reading about things like cognitive biases, it really opened my eyes to recognize that, again, I might not be making the right decision. I might be, every decision I make is biased by my previous experiences. I just want to make sure that those biases are positive and helping me to make the right decision the next time rather than keeping me stuck in the past making the wrong decisions.
This is awesome because we're connecting your external space experience with the internal space of our minds, which is what I love to do on the podcast. So I would love for you to share, because I think the undercurrents of that is if we do not ensure the operational point is properly grounded in evidence and accuracy, everything you build on top and the operation itself is become skewed because of the offset of the operation point. How do you vet or how do you verify to make sure that all your decision points are grounded based on your expertise and feedback and anything in between?
Let me share with you one quick example that I think touches on the premise of your question, especially about cognitive biases. When I was on my final mission, in preparation for that mission, I decided to write down all of the mistakes I made in the simulator. And I had many opportunities over 6 months, 4 hours a day in the sim. I had made hundreds of mistakes. I decided to categorize them by date to see if I was making fewer mistakes as we got closer to launch. But I also decided to categorize the mistakes by consequence, the ones that killed us in the sim versus the ones that merely failed the mission or damaged some hardware or things like that. When I did that analysis after 6 months, it was really amazing to me that the system that I thought I was really good in turns out was the one that I was the weakest in, and it was causing the most critical mistakes that ended in fatality. And the specific reason was because the system was making inputs into the computer in preparation for entry, for example. And the mistake that I made when I entered the wrong trajectory didn't result in an immediate consequence. It was not until 20 minutes later, when the vehicle is deep in the atmosphere and I had put it into a situation where it couldn't reconcile and maybe the wing burned off. But it was a mistake that I made 20 minutes ago, and I didn't realize that until I had done this analysis to see where were the mistakes that I was making. So I think if we can analyze our mistakes with a pretty rigorous method, then we can see and adjust for any cognitive biases that may have been apparent. And then I was able to instigate techniques to make sure that I didn't suffer those same consequences.
I mean, that's like the through line between scientific inquiry, right? Rigorous vetting, trials and tribulations, control group, and so on. I think the problem of over-analysis or over-analyzing is quite more and more relevant today with the rise of misinformation, disinformation, information overload. people and everyone and their mothers proclaiming to be gurus and experts, people tend to overanalyze more and more based on the information feeding loop. Where is that fine line, Jim? How do you make sure it's the optimal point of analysis for the rigor, but then you don't go over to the over-analysis where it only becomes emotional and mental burden?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind is you have to make sure that what you're analyzing has good validity. So is the data set proper, or is it, as you mentioned, misinformation? In that particular example I used, I realized that I was the only one who knew the mistakes I was making. The instructors, who are very good and they're observing me, they don't see internal to my brain and its processes. And maybe I made a thinking mistake that was corrected before I implemented the action because a crew member said, hey, wait a minute, we're supposed to do this. And so I was the only one who was going to have the ultimate accuracy test of the inputs of the data set. The mistakes I was making, I was the only one that was going to know what mistakes I was making. But your point is valid. If you're using external data, you really have to make sure that data set is valid. Otherwise, the analysis will be flawed.
I think that reminds me of like limit test, right? I think more of us need to, utilize limit tests in different settings, emotionally, relationally, interpersonally, or in your case, operationally. Do you have any sort of like mental modeling? I've been into a lot of thought experiments and mental modeling. Mental modeling, just simply put, you create scenarios based on information at hand, and you see how your decisions gets projected, and you vet that and you think about that and cross-reference that. Because of your expertise and risk analysis, do you utilize any mental modeling, or what are some of your thought processes that you can share about?
I think I do, but if you maybe could explain to me a little more about what you mean by mental modeling, then maybe I'll be more accurate in my answer.
Right. It's almost like trying to do what AI does without the AI, us just thinking about a scenario with pros and cons, potential risk, potential ROI. And you think about, if I were to make a decision in that scenario mentally, what are the decisions I will make and what are the potential outcome? But then you try it out again on a different scenario and based on the different outcome that happens, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks for that. So one of the things that I think about to answer that question is when I was not specifically an astronaut or even a commander of a mission, but when I was a manager. So for 5 years, I was the director of flight crew operations at NASA. And I had to make some pretty important decisions regarding crew members and crew assignments and whether or not they should fly in space or not. And some of those decisions could be very difficult. And I would spend all day long thinking about the decision. And if I do this, this happens. If I do another thing, something else will happen. And it seemed like it was always a very tough choice. And I would go home and I'd go to sleep. And the next morning I'd wake up and I'd tell myself after sleeping, so, maybe there's some process going on subconsciously. I would wake up and I'd say, I know what the answer is. It has to be this, even though it's the more difficult decision to make. This program is too important. It's not my program. This is the program of America. And so I have to make the right decision, even though it's the tougher one. And always when I went to sleep and woke up the next morning, somehow automatically that percolated around and then I knew it was the right answer.
I mean, we can spend another 4 hours about like dream analysis, Carl Jung, and subconscious processing. It's pretty profound if anyone's interested, but maybe we'll save that for round 2 down the road. I do want to go into conditioning, because I know conditioning and setting the right conditions that's most conducive for a mission's outcome is very important. Now, you talked about the mission statement and Notre Dame's speech. So in your talk at Notre Dame University, your alma mater, you talked about how in your 20 years, still crazy to say it out loud, of NASA career, you flew for a total of 2 months and spent 19 years and 10 months on the ground. This speaks to the importance of setting the right conditions for the optimal outcome. Any thoughts there given the current instant gratification era that we live in, Jim?
For 3 of the years, I was on the selection board to select new astronauts that were coming in. And initially, I thought that it would be very challenging to have the top 200 candidates out of 17,000 across the nation who were applying to be astronauts. And initially, I thought that would be a very difficult choice to make. How was I to distinguish the top 200 of these people who are all number one in their class, best in everything they've ever done, great recommendations, a lot of experience? But it occurred to me as we started to interview people that it was actually the opposite. I was having trouble finding enough good candidates, and it wasn't their record, it wasn't their experience, it wasn't their grades, or they were really smart, which they were. It was really about teamwork, and did they want to be an astronaut for the personal glory and excitement, or did they recognize they were part of a team? And that's when I realized, if you come here to be an astronaut, maybe you fly for 2 months out of 20 years, but the rest of the time you're supporting other missions, creating the conditions for them to succeed. And you really have to be excited about that. If you are, then you'll be a good astronaut.
200 out of 17,000 best candidates from all around the country. That's statistically pretty crazy. Quick personal curiosity, Jim. From your experiences as a committee, as a director, and so on, what are the qualities that separates the right candidates aside from their ability to endure the mundane, endure the air quote boring stuff, from based on your selection in the past?
Yeah, so of course there's a prerequisite. We call it an eligibility condition. You have to be, you have to have hand-eye coordination. You have to be pretty intelligent, be able to be aware of the situation, calm under pressure, those kinds of things, smart enough to understand the intricacies of how the engines work and the thrust vector control system, on and on and on. But the more important criteria are what we call suitability criteria. Are you really suitable? Yeah, you have the prerequisite knowledge and intelligence, but what makes you a really good candidate? And number one at the top of that list, in my opinion, is teamwork. Wanting to support other people in the mission and recognizing that the mission is far greater than any of us individually. We're doing this for humanity. We're doing this for America. And you really have to understand that. If you do, you'll be willing to do anything to support the mission rather than to get personal excitement or enjoyment out of it.
Of course, you're a veteran. I was in the Army as well. And the term Blue Falcons just came to my mind as you were talking about teamwork. Blue Falcons, it's a military lingo, at least for the Army, just talking about individuals who are not collaborative, who don't really care about the team, who are very individualistic and selfish, at least in military settings. And I think teamwork is such a trope, but I think it really is more relevant than ever, because I do feel like we as a society is becoming more individual driven and individualistic. And as you said, in a culture who's comprised of many, singular decision-making in silo does not help anyone except maybe the self.
Well, so I look at the teamwork training that we get at NASA, and I don't even know if this is a conscious effort. It probably is, or it just ended up this way. When you look at NASA astronaut training, the first part of training is all individual. You really have to be smart enough to do the job. You have to understand the systems, et cetera. So there's a lot of training, solo training, where you're alone with an instructor and you're trying to learn the system. The second phase of training is about teamwork. So now you're put in situations where 2 crew members are working together trying to figure out the solution. But the third stage that we see is when you begin to see the individual disappear. The self does not matter. It's the team, it's the crew, the 5 people or 7 people who are firing on all cylinders, and you have diversity of thought. It really works best if you have different kinds of thinking on a team. And you see these elite team members, let's say we're preparing for a mission, and there's a disagreement about how we want to do things. You see the same thing in SWAT teams out in the world in dangerous situations. Somebody says, I think we ought to do it this way. The response from an elite team member is not, no, I think we should do it this way, but rather it is, tell me more about why you think that's the right way to go. I'm much more interested in what you think than trying to convince you of my answer. Because together, if I understand how you're thinking, now we can come to a transcendent solution that is better than maybe both of us thought individually. So I like to see those three levels of training: self, and then teamwork, and then the disappearance of the self, and the unit becomes the entity that is solving decisions.
I'm going to get married in May upcoming. I've been engaged for a year now. And I think that's what union is, right? You go into this marital contract or long-term committed relationship. This is where my psychotherapy comes in. But you want to uphold the individualistic characteristics, your own standards, your own interests, your essence of who you are, because you don't want to look for someone that makes you whole. That's a very dangerous Western idea. You don't want like, oh, they complete me. That's unhealthy. You don't want them to complete you. You want to be wholesomely yourself that meets someone that makes you better, and vice versa. And I sense a similar ethos where you want the individuality because that's what makes us shine, our characters, our strength, the virtues. But then under high stress situations, you need to let go of the self by becoming this unity. That's what I sense.
Yeah, I love that idea. When I think of marriage, I always think that each person has to feel like they're giving more than 50%. If you think you're giving 60%, you're likely only giving 50 or even 40%. So you have to feel like you're giving more to the relationship. I happen to be very fortunate. You know, one of the questions you asked is, who am I? My first answer is, above all, I'm a husband first. I happen to love my wife. I've loved her since the first time I ever saw her. And it's, going on 40 years now. And she's still the most important person in the world to me. But you do have to feel like you're giving more than 50%.
I will clip that response and send it to your wife after the recording. So I want to ask you to maybe revisit some memory lane, Jim, because I think oftentimes our own resilience surprises us in retrospect, right? I'm sure you have hosts of experiences that were extremely challenging, profoundly difficult, but then you look back, you're like, wow, I've endured that. And that made me stronger. I call that growing pain in life, or the strength stimuli that gives you strength or turns into strength. From your NASA career or training that you just alluded to, Jim, is there a particular or memorable training experiences that really stands out and you're like, holy crap, I cannot believe I was able to endure that?
Well, there are so many. Also, what comes to mind is on the leadership side. I never really wanted to be a leader. Fortunately, I had a boss who thought more highly of me than I did of me. And he always put me in positions before I thought I was ready for 20 years. And each step of the way, I didn't think I was ready, but then I realized after a while, well, I guess he saw something and maybe he knew what he was doing. He allowed me to make mistakes. We bounded the consequence. I learned from them, and then he would put me in a more challenging situation. I think that's what companies should do to develop leaders for the future, is to continue to give progressively more challenging experiences and allow people to realize that that they can learn and become better. And I've often said, you are the best leader the day you retire, because we never stop learning.
Yeah, I mean, in education space, they call that scaffolding, right? I think the research shows humans or students or people, we thrive the best when we're dealing with about 10 to 15% more challenging problems than our current capacity. If it's more than that, we feel defeated, right? Shame, guilt, worthlessness sink in. But 10 to 15% increased challenges than our current perceived capacity, that's what shows to be the most optimal for growth mindset and growth.
I often meet people when I'm on the road giving speeches, and they marvel at how you can climb on top of a rocket with 4.5 million pounds of explosive energy and 7 million pounds of thrust and function correctly. And it's not something you just do. It's over 14 years you learn through progressively more challenging situations, flying an airplane onto an aircraft carrier at night, and the deck is pitching and you can't see anything and it's really scary. But you do it a few times and you get better and better at it. And after 14 years, you've had all these very small improvements and increases in challenging situations. And it's not all of a sudden you're climbing on a rocket. It's the next step in the journey of this operational career, which I've been so fortunate and privileged to have.
I mean, you're an actual part of the history. That's not an easy or overstatement. I do want to zoom into that validation that your mentor or the leader, I guess, bestowed upon you for seeing in your potential that you didn't even see yourself. I think currently, Jim, that a lot of men struggle with this. A lot of young men, they lack role models, either single parents households or just, once again, all these talking heads out there who it's all about self gains. People underestimate the power of validation. I have male patients in my work says, "Oh, I don't need no validations." So I asked, "How about yourself? Do you validate yourself?" It's like, I guess. I was like, yeah, well, humans are wired prehistorically to be social animals, and validation is part of our human nature. What role, in retrospect, Jim, did that validation do to you, not just for the immediate leadership role, but just across your lifespan? Because that's what mentorship is to me, is mentors who believe in you more than yourself.
Well, I think it's huge. Fortunately, I had great parents. My father was a Army Air Corps pilot in World War II, and then director of flight crew operations for American Airlines for a lot of years. And he would just look at me if I made a dumb decision, and just that look, without even saying anything, told me he was disappointed in me. Conversely, if I did something well, I mean, it didn't have to be verbal verification or validation. I could just tell that he knew there's only one way to do things, and that's to do them right. And when I would do it right, and he would just kind of give me that half smile, that was all the validation I needed, and it was huge. My mother, the same way. She was a little more verbal and just a very funny person and never said a mean word about anyone ever. So I learned so much from both of them, and, a lifetime of validation. And then you get into the professional world, and I've had mentors throughout my career that have validated the things I was doing. And it does give you the confidence, well, maybe I am on the right track and maybe I can do this.
I was actually planting seed for this question. I think you would appreciate, Jim. What separates a great leader from a horrible one, since a large part of your job is to improve organizational culture to control risk, since leadership does play a fundamental role?
Yeah, so when we look at operating leaders who are working in dangerous fields, who are very successful, they do three things much different than other people. Number one, I call these the 3 C's. Number one, intense commitment to the mission. They really understand the objectives that the organization is trying to achieve. Number two, they really care about the people. And it's not because the people are helping us to satisfy the mission or accomplish the mission. It's because as a leader, I want you to be self-actualized. I want you to reach your greatest potential. I really like the people. In the more dangerous the situation, I really love the people that I'm working with, especially if I'm asking them to go into harm's way. And number three, competence. And I mean competence in the true mastery sense of the word. They really understand the dangerous situation, the hazards that are out there, the technical aspects of the job. They instantly assess a solution, share it widely with other teams so that others can, be successful as well. So commitment, care, and competence really sets these leaders apart from other leaders, I think.
And I'm guessing all of them have the underlying quality of humility, as you also talked about.
If they're good, yes, exactly. I've read some things even recently from some pretty intelligent, smart people with a lot of practical experience that good leaders need to show vulnerability. And I've never liked that word. I don't, if I'm a follower, I don't want to follow a leader who's vulnerable, but I will follow a leader who's humble. And maybe there's a subtle difference, but to me, it's a very important difference. I want a leader who knows he or she doesn't know everything, wants my opinion, but then is decisive and makes a decision based on his or her extensive experience. There are too many, often when I do speeches, I'll ask the question, do you know somebody who shows supreme confidence and insufficient humility? And almost everybody will raise their hand. Sometimes I think, by the way, if you show insufficient humility, I think that's really, you're the can tell me if this is right or not. I have a theory that they're compensating for some lack of confidence, and they're attempting to show that they have supreme confidence when they really don't. And so they don't appear humble at all.
Yeah, I mean, not to get too deep into it, but at least clinically and psychologically, a lot of narcissism is actually fragile narcissism. Their narcissistic tendencies it's a compensatory mechanism to cover up their fragility, their fragile ego, their feeling lack of. Man, like I said, this is such a relevant topic if you extrapolate it, right? Because when a person, the beholders of power in high positions, are covering up their lack of, because as you said, the more you know nothing. Aristotle, right? So, and when they don't have that, a lot of their decisions are skewed and has ripple effect across culture, which is a very big part of your work, organizational culture. And I think that's more and more relevant today with, once again, social media, social proof, these superficial validation and so on.
Two quick stories. In my job, I've had an opportunity to meet an awful lot of famous people, various worlds, musicians, politicians, et cetera, business. And I find that 90% of the people who are at the top of their profession, who are really famous, are just nice people, and they're confident, and they're not trying to prove anything, and they're really fun to be around. 10%, I think, are trying to prove something, and maybe they lack a little bit of confidence. The other story is, I've often, when I was learning to be an astronaut and studying, I found that the best knowledge was not in the workbook, and it was not from the instructor, and it wasn't even from practical simulation training where you're trying to develop the skill, but it was rather going to the world's experts, the person who designed the system. And I would often go and knock on the door and say, hey, could you explain this to me? And the people who are really good at what they do are always willing to share their knowledge and expertise. Oh, come on in, let me explain that to you. And they would sit down and talk for 4 hours and give me all this world-class knowledge. And my conclusion is people who are really good at what they do are confident enough to share that knowledge, and they like talking about what they do. It's their life's passion, and so they really enjoy it. So I learned from the best once I realized that they're willing to share their knowledge.
Yeah, I do something. Obviously, I'm not world-class, and as of now, what I do interpersonally is I share and integrate what I learned in real life. Like if I learned a concept, I will share that on this podcast, or otherwise, if I'm reading a book, I try to incorporate concepts. And because integration is key to knowledge retainment. It's not about the amount of books you read, the amount of people you speak to, the amount of knowledge you obtain. It's how are you integrating that and moving that memory from short-term domain to long-term domain. And you implement, you integrate, and you practice. And I sense that theme.
Yeah, I love that. That's great.
Yeah. The downside is my fiance gets sick of me talking about all these things. She's like, enough. I get it. You're trying to integrate, but please share that with someone else.
I have the same thing when I start talking about leadership. But sometimes it works. Like I was trying to teach my kids to be safe. And when you realize, they would kind of, oh, Dad. But a couple months later, they would see me doing something slightly unsafe. And they'd say, oh, Dad, watch what you're doing. And then you kind of realize, well, they are listening, they are learning.
And that's the validation we're talking about, right? But
yeah.
Speaking of your family, I want to go personal and maybe tie this into the ethos of your book, Jim. Why should people really care about the topic of controlling risk? I know you talked about the difference between controlling and managing, but there are so many variables out there. I do feel like the world is getting a little bit more dangerous, aside from the conflict that's happening now in the Middle East. There's a lot of dangers, active shootings, right? Man, I'm part of church, and I'm in a small group who are mostly with family and kids, and just thinking about the gruesome and the dark reality of parents nowadays have to be normalized to the fact that schools are doing active shooting drill. That was not a thing 6 years ago, So with all these risk factors at bay, Jim, why is this topic more important than ever?
Well, simply stated, it will save your life or even reduce the possibility of injury if you're aware of your surroundings and you understand how to control your environment to reduce the risk as low as you can. Quick example, even in day-to-day life, not even talking about society in general and how dangerous it's getting, but the biggest risk I think many people face is driving a car. And, many companies have a rule that says you should not use a cell phone when you're driving a car on company time. But I often try to help people by thinking, what's a better technique you can use? Sure, if you don't use a cell phone when you're driving, you can prevent most accidents. But if you really want to prevent all accidents in a car, how about try to identify and avoid all distractions? Maybe it's the conversation I'm having in the car with the passenger, or maybe it's a song on the radio, or maybe I'm thinking about the meeting that I'm late for. Try to avoid those distractions. Said positively, try to identify where all the other drivers are going and don't put your car in a place that it can possibly be hit. Use all the defensive driving techniques, etc. But you can predict where the other drivers are going to be in the next few seconds with experience and paying attention and being aware of your surroundings. So, these kinds of things I think they're relatively simple. And if you can master them, you can stay alive. And like I wrote in my book, I hope to die as a very old controller of risk.
The techniques are working so far. I want to highlight another variable. I think that's really contributing to dangers and risk factors, distractions, right? You alluded that to your driving. I think aside from cognitive biases, aside from lack of mindfulness and attention span for most with the era of death of attention, distractions is something that's really, really detrimental. Internal thoughts, intrusive thoughts. When you're driving, you're thinking about something else, your meeting that's coming. Do you have any personal practices, any thoughts to really control the distractions so you can be optimal at what you're focusing?
Yeah, so the classic example that I think of is in the simulator, as a crew got close to a mission, they would get more and more focused on the things that are really important, and they would not want to be distracted by anything non-important. So the specific example is when the commander was on final approach, getting ready to land the space shuttle in the simulator, the most critical thing you must do is put the landing gear down. We can't put them down before 10 seconds before touchdown. And if you get distracted by the instructor on the console who types in some kind of an emergency and you forget to put the gear down, that's when you die. And so too many of the commanders would say, I want to eliminate all distractions on short final. Don't bother me with anything that's going on in the systems. We must put the gear down. Well, I was the opposite. When we got into training close to mission, I welcomed people to try to distract me so that I could develop the mental discipline to mentally avoid that distraction. And I would say, tell me everything that's going on with the system, and I will still concentrate and land the vehicle with the gear down. So there are personal techniques, mental techniques you can do to avoid the distraction. It's the same thing in the car. I don't mind having conversations, but my brain will be focused on the other drivers and where their cars are going, and maybe I'm going to miss something in the conversation. It's a technique you can practice and you can get really good at it.
I'm going to start that because last week I missed an exit in LA because I was cracking a joke with my fiance and I missed the exit, which resulted in 20 extra minutes. But I want to go into on the realm of like eliminating distractions and control. Can you share a couple of techniques that you can think about that is very applicable and practical, since yours is all about practical wisdom for just everyday users? It doesn't have to be car related, just a couple of techniques.
In general, the way to learn something, I think, is knowledge, skill, and attitude. So the KSA. So first is understand what causes distractions, understand how the brain works, the subconscious, the conscious. Know that your conscious mind is doing one thing at a time. When we multitask, it is not the conscious brain that's multitasking. It is the subconscious that's doing automatic tasks. And the conscious brain, or I call it the controlled part of the brain rather than automatic, the controlled part can be rapidly switching back and forth between two things, but it's really only doing one thing at a time. So understand how your brain works. The second is the skill part, is to develop techniques. So be aware of potential distractions and how they come into your brain, and avoid them by knowing what is the thing that you're really trying to accomplish, whether it's a driving task or a conversation when you're giving a speech. You know, I'm up on stage and I'm doing speeches all the time, and you can be distracted, but I'm always thinking of the higher level thought of what am I trying to convey to the audience. And you can practice to just not let the distraction intrude into your controlled part of your brain. And then the mental attitude part is know that this will help me to perform better. So I'm going to practice it for the next several weeks to make sure I get really good at it. That's the way I try to do it, to understand how the brain works, welcome distractions to make sure that I have the ultimate goal. And I'll say one last thing, example. I disagree with the concept that if somebody says, don't think about a pink elephant, and of course I have to think about a pink elephant now. Well, I don't think that's true. I can put things into my conscious mind, my controlled part of my brain, to think about that doesn't allow the pink elephant to come into my brain. So if I'm thinking about an answer talking to you right now, I'm thinking about the ultimate point that I'm trying to make, and I'm not allowing anything else to come in. So I can precondition my controlled part of my brain through volitional cognition, intent, think about the ultimate goal, and that helps me avoid all the other distractions. I hope that works for people. It works for me. I don't know if this is in your practical experience when you're talking to folks, but it really works for me to put things into my brain that I want to think about, and then it's a lot easier to avoid the distractions.
I mean, of course, this is a cultivated long-term practice. And I love when you debunked multitask. Like factually, multitask is a myth. We switch task.
Yeah.
People don't multitask. I know women are better at that, but at the end of the day, it's still switch tasking.
Yeah, I think they switch more rapidly than men do.
Yep, because women have better lateral thinking. Men have better linear thinking cognitively. Yeah. But I want to go into something that you talked about where like the neocortex and limbic brain. Like limbic brain just colloquially means emotional content. You're reacting emotionally to circumstances like fight, flight, or freeze. Typically speaking, neocortex is what makes humans the ultimate apex predator, because we're not just animalistic. We're not enslaved by our desires, right? Just because you want to reproduce evolutionarily doesn't mean you have to reproduce with anyone you see on the street, neocortex. But speaking of neocortex, I want to talk about, I think, and from what I've read, one of the most dangerous jobs in this world, which is landing an aircraft carrier on a Navy ship. Of course, you're a retired captain. I don't know if you've done that yourself. And I'm sure you know a lot about that, why landing an aircraft carrier is such a dangerous job, the people who are wearing the vest and all that. But can you explain this, and feel free to go wherever you feel called to?
Yeah, so the common statement that you hear from naval aviators, if somebody asks how many carrier landings do you have, in my case, And the answer is 345. Which one do you want to hear about? and the point is, everyone is different and unique, and it's burned into our memories forever. It is a very fun experience. When I think back on it, it's exhilarating. It's kind of the epitome or the peak of controlling your mental processes. And sadly, I learned this on a night when, and this ties back to the concept of confidence balanced with humility. So I was coming down on the ship one night, a particularly dark and scary night. The ship was pitching up and down. I could hear the voices of the other pilots going up a couple octaves, because there's a lot of fear out there. People are scared. And I'm coming down the chute thinking, this is the best job on the planet. I was born to do this, and I was supremely confident. I realized a little bit too late that confidence is good, but supreme confidence can be deadly. And as I crossed the ramp to a hard landing, because I allowed my mind to be distracted and wander, thinking about this is the best job, and my brother had a lousy job back in New York. He was a golf pro, and I'm doing the best job in the world. Fortunately, I didn't damage any hardware, but my psyche was pretty well destroyed. And I realized I had done this to myself. Sometimes the hazards are not in the external environment. Sometimes they're inside my helmet. And I allowed my mind to wander. And I learned I have got to develop the mental discipline to stay focused on what's important during dangerous times in an operation. And it actually became even more exhilarating and more fun. And it actually boosted my confidence over time when I realized I was able to really focus. It's kind of a Zen thing, and it's really fun to be at one with the vehicle, to sense everything, to feel everything, to not worry about the future. I may die 10 seconds from now, but that's not here yet. I'm thinking about right now, and to be so in control of my mental processes and physical processes is really a fun, exhilarating thing to do.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of flow and flow states at its purest form. Flow state is awesome. It really is. And I know you're an also aerospace engineer and you have engineering backgrounds. So this question might bore you, but just for context, can you maybe dissect and share some intricacies mechanically or otherwise that's involved aside from ship, floating, the weather, the external conditions, the psyche that you talked about? But what are the actual mechanical intricacies involved that makes landing an aircraft supremely difficult for the navigator and the aviator alike? Yeah,
the ship is moving both in translation as it's going through the ocean, but it's also pitching up and down, and it could be pitching this way or it could be heaving up and down. The optical system that we're looking at gives a 3.5 degree glide slope, or I think it's 3.5 degrees, where you precisely must control the airplane when the hook to ramp, when you cross the ramp, the hook to ramp distance is 14 feet. You are allowed plus or minus 2 feet. Any lower than that, you risk hitting the back end of the ship and killing a lot of people, including yourself. And if you're too high, then you bolt or miss the arresting cable, and then you have to come around and try it again. So very tight tolerances. The speeds you could be 160 knots. The angle of attack has to be precise. Everything has to be really precise. And if it doesn't work, you either die or you have to do it again and risk dying a second time. There are many things in naval aviation and the space program that end with, and then you die if you don't do it right. So that pressure, mental pressure, and the physical task is what I really loved. When you're rendezvousing on a spacecraft with a space station up in space, two vehicles that are 100 tons each of mass, you're traveling at 17,500 miles an hour with a tolerance, a relative velocity of 1/10 of a foot per second with a tolerance of 3/100ths of a foot per second. If you hit too hard, you damage the hardware. If you hit too softly, then you bounce off and you have to do it again. And you have 3 inches, plus or minus 3 inches. But up in space, you don't have the turbulence that you do of the atmosphere. And so it can be very controlled. There are nuances in the flight control system that cause it to pitch when you translate and translate when you're rotating and these kinds of things. But all those are mental things that you can be aware of. But the biggest challenge, I think, is the being ready for an emergency if a computer fails or a jet fails or something happens at the last moment that causes the vehicle to move when it shouldn't be moving, understanding the system and whether or not the system is degrading or going to a less optimal mode. All those kinds of things are mental, but I rather enjoyed the mental aspect of it almost, well, probably even much more than the physical aspects of it. I could teach anyone to develop the physical skill to do a rendezvous in space, almost anyone. But it's whether or not you have the mental fortitude to be able to be prepared for any emergencies and know what to do when bad things start happening.
I really do believe that most things in life are mental. I really feel like the game of life is a mental game. It really is, if you really dig deep, because what's internal externalizes externally, right? Another quick personal curiosity. I've heard this a lot on the podcast and shows with different astronauts. They said the most blissful, beautiful scenery they've ever seen is the orbit. Like when you're on the space shuttle looking at the sun, not the sun, don't look at the sun, of course, at the Earth at its full glory. Is that true? And yeah, like what is that like, since I'm probably not going to be a billionaire tomorrow? So chance of me going to space anytime soon is pretty dim. So I like to live vicariously through you.
Well, it's unbelievable. It's almost mind-blowing. It's just so, not to be funny, but it really is out of this world. It's just a different view. It is so clear that it almost looks like it's a simulation by some fantastic AI system down on the Earth, because you're not looking through the atmosphere. It almost looks like a cartoon, a high definition cartoon. But you look at the ocean and you see these giant swirling eddy patterns in the ocean, or solitons, which are subsurface density interfaces in the water that manifest as a surface textural change that you see reflected in the sun glint. These giant solitons are 20 miles long and maybe 2 miles crest to crest. You couldn't see them if you're in a boat on the surface of the ocean because it manifests only a couple of centimeters, but the reflection creates these giant swirling patterns in the ocean. You can look at like thunderstorm systems that are 400 miles long, and the whole system will be dormant for 5 seconds, and then all of a sudden, the whole system starts lighting up with lightning. Bam, 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 bam. And then it goes dormant for another 5 seconds. And you look at that and you wonder, well, how does it communicate 400 miles away that it's time to start firing lightning? Or you look at the nighttime side of the atmosphere glows green in color. The top of the atmosphere is green in color. It's just really is mind-blowing. It's a phenomenon called Joule heating, where the molecules of oxygen give off a photon as they cool, drop down to a lower energy state. It almost looks like it's the limb of the Earth, but you can see stars through it. So it's the atmosphere glowing. And then when you look at the number of stars in the galaxy, even with the human eye, tens of thousands of stars visible, all different colors, mostly white, some yellowish, some bluish, some reddish or brownish. Didn't see any green ones. And they don't flicker, just points of light. And then you look at the Large Magellanic Cloud, one of only 3 things you can see outside the galaxy without a telescope. And you think, that light left that object 160,000 years ago, and it's still just now hitting my eye. So many of the astronauts, early astronauts, had a revelation or a change in perspective, or, they felt closer to God, whatever. I didn't feel any of that because the way I explain it is, I don't need to leave the Earth to sense that. I look around at this Earth and I go, wow, this place is a beautiful part of the universe. You think about a tree and, well, no, wait a minute. How does the water go up the root, up the trunk, combine with chlorophyll in the leaf and take the sun's energy to make life and make molecules that change? How can this be? And you think about the number of cells you have in your body and the DNA and the brain and how it works. And it's like, man, this is a wonderful universe created by God, and I don't need to leave Earth to sense that. But I don't want to, I want to tell you it's just an amazing scene, and I wish everybody could see what the Earth looks like from space.
I will definitely add a lot of visual B-rolls to really portray that to the best of my ability. And I've been geeking out on James Webb Telescope, right? Obviously, it was a monumental success for the program, especially with $20 billion at stake, 20 years of hard work by over 100 world-class astrophysicists, literally their life's work. And of course, it was successful. But when I first saw the images in Ultra HD, it was awe-inducing. Goosebumps nonstop. And you're like, man, it's insane. You feel small. It really puts things into perspective. It's a very niche therapy, but it's called cosmic therapy. It's not an evidence-based therapy by any means, but just collectively look at the stars. Maybe not in LA, where the sky is gray from all the pollution, but outside of LA, you look at the sky and just contemplate your problems. It's very stoic. Really puts life into perspective and how infinitely small we are and insignificant we are. And that's why we need to do what we can do. But I can't even imagine that view.
Yeah, and a lot of people respond to the visual from the Webb telescope and truly inspiring photos, just really wonderful pictures, glorious. But what I'm waiting for is the analysis that comes later when the scientists and physicists write the papers and they change our understanding of the universe. To me, that will be just as glorious as the pictures.
Yeah, the deep fields and the origins of the universe, right? Oh, I'm also eagerly waiting for that. And I'm going to stack your episode with an astrophysicist. He's actually a Christian, Dr. Jeff, to make it thematic. But we were just talking about how people talk about time traveling, time machine. Time traveling is already possible. You talked about it by looking at the stars. That's billions of light years away. By the time the light hits you, your optics, that star might have ceased to exist. You're literally peeping into the past concurrently in the present. These are the things that it's so awesome to think about, right? It's man, it's so much unknown. And it's
to me, it's a privilege just to be alive on Earth. And then you think about the moon and how it allows life to exist. If we didn't have the moon, we would not look like we do because we wouldn't have a magnetic field because the molten core wouldn't be spun up. We wouldn't have an atmosphere. The radiation would be bombarded from the sun. Maybe there would be life here, but it certainly wouldn't look like us without the moon. And this is just a glorious universe. And it's a huge privilege to be on the planet, even greater privilege to be able to leave and come back.
I agree with everything you said. But speaking of privileges, Jim, I want to go into what you wrote as the most meaningful part. Of course, the Columbia accident and all that, and maybe tie this into organizational culture. So, Jim, as the director of the flight crew operations, you were selected after the Columbia accident. I think it killed 7 astronauts, if I'm not mistaken, to enhance the safety aspects in the organizational culture at the Johnson Space Center. Can you just walk me through that experience? Because it is pretty bleak, right? As I said, there is high risk factors. People do die. But what did you learn about the importance of organizational culture from that experience and beyond?
Well, I was the off-going commander. I had flown the last successful mission on STS-113 on Endeavour, and then Columbia was the next one to launch, and they perished over East Texas, came down over 10,000 square miles of East Texas landscape, and I was asked to make the decisions, be the leader of a group, 2,000 people that went out searching for and recovering with dignity, honor, and reverence the human remains of the Columbia crew. Just a tremendous experience. Again, a great privilege for me to have done that and to be associated with 2,000 of the best people on the planet who recognized a mission that was far greater than themselves. And they came together over 13 days around Nacogdoches, Texas, and searched in really dangerous, treacherous conditions to find the human remains of the Columbia crew. I was inspired by the people. I had learned over the years what good leaders do. I had learned an awful lot about what bad leaders do, and I tried to avoid those kinds of things. And then after that evolution, I was asked to restore the culture at the Johnson Space Center and then at all 10 NASA centers. At that point, I had 26 years of operational experience in various organizational cultures, but I began to study and learn the academic side, the theoretical side of what constitutes organizational culture. And I had a great privilege of speaking with Edgar Schein, the guy who kind of created the concept of organizational culture back in the 40s when he was looking at IBM and writing the seminal books about organizational culture. And as I read, I said, yep, that's what happens. I've seen that before. And it was so apparent to me that the culture is created by what the leaders do at the top of the organization, and it permeates. It is very powerful. When you're a new employee and you come in, even if you are not versed in how the brain works or social aspects or culture or anything, you will pick up on the culture almost immediately. And you will see what are the accepted practices. How can I be successful? These are the kinds of things I do. It is very powerful, especially I use the example at 2 a.m. when there are no leaders around, somebody is going to make a decision and take an action and either increase the risk or decrease the risk based on the perceived organizational culture and the shared norms and all that, which is created by the leaders. It's very powerful. Leaders who don't understand that can damage the culture very quickly. I've seen it happen. And if you're a good leader and you want to nurture a great culture, it requires constant effort. That's one of the things I've learned. You really have to work at it, or the culture will degrade and you'll have accidents. And it's almost every major accident is always one or more of the same 10 things going on in the organization. It's always the same. It never changes. And it would be so, I don't want to say it would be easy or simple. These things can be avoided. It's just that we don't know how to avoid them, or we haven't taken the time to understand the impacts or the effects of organizational culture.
I think, like, semantics aside, there are different ways of viewing culture, because I'm very into system thinking as a former policymaker before my career pivot. We talked about this during our discovery call, Jim. Like, people often feel very depressed and almost feel like this dooming mentality when they think about how can we possibly change a system politically, socially, economically. But then we forget culture in its simplest form is comprised of individual decision makers. And culture is relationship, right? You talked about the decision either moves you closer to the mission or farther away. Complacency kills is a universal truth in every aspect. Like, going back to the marriage and relationship we talked about earlier, if you're not actively working closer to maintain the integrity of your relationship, relationally, your relationship drifts apart. That's why we're dealing with 60% lifetime divorce rate in America. 60%. That's a staggeringly high number. It's because most people get complacent, right? But you have to actively exert effort because change is constant. But wouldn't we want to, like you said, control the change towards a positive direction?
If I'm a leader in an organization and I want to change the culture or improve the culture and then nurture it, there's a lot of great books you can read about how to do that, and it can be pretty complicated and extensive checklists, et cetera. I simplify it to the 3 basic steps that a leader should take. First of all, explain to people, here are the expectations, here's how I want you to succeed in the organization. Have that conversation so it's 2-way, not just 1-way. Don't just tell them this is what I want you to do, but do you understand? Here's why I want you to do it. Here's how it'll help you, et cetera. What do you think about this? On and on. Number 1, tell people what you want. Number 2, help them succeed. So give them the proper training, give them the tools, give them the time to do it right, and help them succeed. Number 3, and this is the most important one, when they do succeed, help them feel good about it. Give them the reward. And I don't mean financially, although maybe that's part of it, but just, hey, I saw what you did there. That was really cool. I liked what you did there. Tell me how it made you feel. Did it make you think that you were safer or controlling the risk or improving the mission outcome, et cetera. So tell people what you want, help them succeed, and then make them feel good when they do succeed, and the culture will change.
I love the through lines in our conversation, because back to psychology, positive reinforcement. Like research shows that positive reinforcement outworks negative reinforcement. Not to dismiss the role of negative reinforcement, since there are nuances and sometimes like punishment is a great motivator, but more often than not, positively validating someone, because you're also like, this like behaviorism. It's like conditioning a dog. When you don't bark on the street, you get a treat. Of course, humans are not dogs because we do have a neocortex, but we have this prehistoric genetics, and conditioning also works for humans. So I really want to put that on a messaging board. Validation, positive reinforcement goes a long, long way.
Yeah. It even works with kids, although it's a lot harder because for the following reason. If you have a child and you give them your expectations, clearly define the boundaries, and then immediate positive reinforcement or negative if it needs to be works really well. But the problem with children is you can't always predict what they're going to do, so it's hard to set the boundaries. You don't know where they're going to go or what they're going to do next. And if you didn't tell them they weren't allowed to do something and they do it, I mean, you can't really punish them too much because they're just exploring. So good luck in your marriage.
Thank you. Well received. Yeah, a former guest who was a parent told me that the best way to possess the faculty of humility is having kids.
I like it.
Because it really teaches you that some things are just not within your willed house of control. And especially from 0 to 2, the critical stage for a lot of like kids and infants. But I do want to go into your book, Jim, since you talked about the 3 C's and some of the characteristics that's conducive for positive organizational culture. From your book, Jim, what are the 10 adverse characteristics in organization before disaster? Just go to the other side of the spectrum.
Maybe I'll give you the top 3. By far, the number one, and 5 of them are on the technical side, and then 5 of them are on the social side of the socio-technical organization. By far, the number one adverse condition in place before an accident is we see the leaders or the executives in the company that pay more attention to results to the exclusion of the quality of individual activities. So if you're a leader and you come in for a quarterly town hall meeting and you say, we didn't meet the numbers last quarter, we have to do better this quarter. If that's all you say, people will take shortcuts because they will try to achieve the numbers that you're asking for this quarter. What the good leaders say is, yes, it's fair to have the conversation. We didn't meet the numbers last quarter, but here's how we're going to improve next quarter. We're going to work on the quality of individual activities and group activities. We're going to work on the process. Nobody is creating results. It's activities integrated over time that create good results. And by the way, a single poor quality activity can result in disaster. So you have to watch out for that. So you really have to attend to the quality of activities. If I'm a senior leader and I'm talking to a frontline operator, yeah, it's fair to talk about results, but you really want to ask them, how can I help you improve the quality of what you're doing? That's by far number one. Another one that I find that's really important is this concept of accountability, which is widely misinterpreted in the oil and gas industry and in many industries. Accountability, it's very well understood on the negative side, where I get blamed if there's an accident or he's the person that was responsible. People understand that concept very well. But what I want to see is, where is the accountability before the accident, or where's the accountability before operations begin to degrade? How do we exercise the process of accountability when there's nothing bad going on? And the answer is, if you think about the word responsibility, it means to do. It's in my contract, this is what I'm supposed to do. But my accountability is not a higher level responsibility. Accountability is to comes from the business word. Think of the root of the word accounting, to open up the books and give an account. So if I have a boss who comes to me like the same mentor I was talking about, every 2 weeks he would come and ask me questions as I was the director of flight crew operations. Questions like, what happened last week? What's coming up next week? Do you have all the resources you need? How are things going in the office? Are people making the right decisions? Are people telling you when they don't have sufficient resources to do things right? Because I had to answer his questions, I felt accountable to him. So now I had not only my personal integrity motivating me to do a good job, but I also had the accountability I had to answer to him. The point is, if nobody's asking you questions, you are not accountable to anyone. You are soon to be accountable to your wife. She's going to be asking you questions. CEOs are accountable to the board, but only if the board is coming and asking questions. So people often misunderstand the concept of accountability. And it's a lot easier if you do it every couple of weeks rather than waiting till the end of the year. And the questions, as you said, the questions are more powerful if they're positive. How can I help? What do you need? Then this accountability will help to prevent accidents. There's a third one, but I don't want to go into it unless you have the time.
Yeah, no, we can. I just want to say quickly, like, this is awesome. And I just want to add one thing before you continue on the third one. It's a concept in psychology called narrative fallacy. It's based colloquially hindsight 2020. So narrative fallacy constitutes that when humans recall past events, since memory recall you're not recalling a stored memory, you're reconstructing it. That's how memory works. And reconstructions implies there is room for error because memories are flawed. That's why witness testimony in the court system is severely flawed and is no longer the primary way of identifying criminals or people who've done the deeds, right? But I'm sharing this because, as you said, I love the biweekly or this frequent check-in mechanism through questionings and Socratic questioning, because without that practice, when you recall the past events, trying to analyze the mistakes based on this hindsight 2020 view, through the phenomena of narrative fallacy, you're going to reconstruct a false narrative because hindsight 2020 gave us an illusion that if I were to be able to recall a certain event as such, it must have happened that simply. No, it didn't. Your brain is so efficient, you simplified it. So I just wanted to share that before you continue.
Yeah, it brings to mind a similar aspect that occurs in accident investigations where retrospectively it's very clear the lines of causality that created the accident, but before the accident it's not so clear. And what we find, this comes from the work of the great Sidney Decker, a wonderful author. He's written some great books on accident investigations, and he often says the accident team asks the wrong question. They generally ask what went wrong or why did they fail to do the right thing. A better accident investigation occurs when you ask the question, why did they think what they did was the right thing to do? And if you can answer that question, now you can change the conditions in the future to influence the people in the future to not make the same kind of decision that results in the accident. So I always try to, why did they think what they did was the right thing to do? It's a positive way of getting at an accident investigation.
Yeah, I mean, I love Sidney Decker. I actually reached out to appear on my guest, never heard back, because I saw the name in the book Black Box Thinking by Matthew Syed that we talked about. But yeah, we'd love for you to share the third characteristics, because I don't like the term like information or knowledge is power. Since we live in knowledge overload, I do feel like appliance is power. So definitely love all the practical wisdom from you.
Yeah, so that leads me to the third one. That's one of the more powerful conditions that can create adverse conditions that can create the situation for an accident or a tragedy in an organization. And it's when the organization fails to conduct the assurance process properly. So the point is, and I worked for the guy who was in charge of all of human spaceflight when we were designing the International Space Station, and he's overseeing hundreds of contractors and subcontractors and thousands of people. And the point is, there's no single manager who's smart enough to understand all of the facets that go into designing and building and launching an international space station, or even doing any of the jobs that companies have down on the Earth. So what the decision makers need is a process of assurance. Assurance means a person is giving me a prediction of future performance of a contractor or subcontractor or my team, whatever. A prediction of future performance based on my observations of current and past performance with some uncertainties. And so you have a team. Most companies do have teams that go out and they do audits or inspections, or they look at various things that a subcontractor is doing. But this process of assurance is taking all that collective body of information and using my experience, creating a prediction of future performance. I predict this subcontractor will continue to give us good connectors because I've watched their inspection process. I know their quality process. And I predict they're going to continue to give us good conductors. Or not, I might see the reverse. They don't have a good enough process of quality or how they're verifying and validating the testing methods, all these things that go into it. I predict they're not going to do well. And now the executive can make a decision to send either more resources or influence them to improve their quality of their processes. But so many companies don't have this overarching process of assurance. They do the mundane basic things like audits, but they don't do the higher level prediction of I'm assessing and evaluating everything and I predict what's going to happen. If all organizations had a good assurance process, we'd be far better off as a society, I think.
I mean, but that implies exerting a lot of effort, systematic, infrastructure, which costly for resources, time, and energy and effort.
Yeah.
And laziness is deeply embedded in human nature.
And, companies always want to know what's the business case because I'm about to invest. And I used to honor that question and try to give them a business case. But anymore, you just look and you say, well, do you want to waste $60 billion with an accident or not? I mean, there's your business case. You're going to waste billions of dollars if you don't invest a couple of $100,000 because accidents will repeat. I mean, that's why I'm in business. That's why people keep calling me to come and give speeches, because they continue to have accidents that are preventable.
Yeah, I chose not to go into like black box thinking and like the difference between aviation culture and healthcare culture that we talked about, because that's a loaded conversation. But what I like to share from that book by Matthew Syed, Black Box Thinking, similar as like a Sydney deck, it's similar books, ethos. It talks about in healthcare, before they improved the organizational culture, since healthcare is very hierarchical, right? Whatever the attending physician says goes. Nurses, junior physicians, and trainings, not a lot of them have the audacity to challenge the decision made by, air quote, top of the pyramid. And it is very pervasive, less so now, because the book was written about 10 years ago. But the point is, his argument, the business case you talked about, do you want to continue to spend billions of dollars for malpractice lawsuits because of entirely preventable mistakes, because nobody dared to challenge your decision in the operating room? And because of that, culturally, nobody was able to speed bump or do assurance or do auditing based on your decisions. Now that's less pervasive, but like prevention is always better than reaction, period.
Yeah.
So
powerful stuff.
Yeah. I do have one more question as we're wrapping up the conversation, Jim. I want to bring this full circle into the beginning when you talked about the power of diversity of thoughts. I've been spending a lot of time offline this year talking about diversity of thoughts and the lack thereof in the current socio-political climate that's burning down. We're not going to go into politics. This is not a political show, but I think a deeply seated contributing factor to this polarity, the left, the right, the liberal, the Democrat, whatever language you want to use, is because the lack of diversity of thoughts and the rapid rise of echo chamber or mind hive. And echo chamber and biases has nothing to do with intelligence. Like people think the smarter you are, the less nuanced, or the more nuanced and more open you are. That's not true. The smarter you are, the better you're at contextualizing your rationale. And you actually are good at doubling down on your stance against the others. So study shows that intelligence actually correlates with like echo chamber, or just, I guess, dogma or stubbornness. I want to use that as our last question because I sense a lot of that in your career, even now, when you are the VP of BP, when you're still consulting for companies, giving speeches, plus your 20 years in NASA. I sense your humility aside, your ability to be receptive towards diversity of thoughts and really reintegrating and reconfiguring your thoughts and references at times. Why is diversity of thoughts such an underrated topic that not a lot of people are talking about, and why is this so important?
Your question is more profound than I thought it was going to be. Let me start by giving just a practical example from my experience to demonstrate. So when we're training for a mission, the commander and the pilot, the two in the front seat, are making most of the decisions. And on one of the crews I was training with, I had a pilot who thought almost exactly like I do. And it was very comfortable. It was very pleasant to work with this pilot. He or she could almost finish my sentences without me even concluding the thought. And it was just a joy to fly with him or her in the simulator getting ready for flight. But we made more mistakes than other crews because we thought identically. So we had the same weaknesses and we overlooked the same things. On another crew, I flew with a crew member whose thinking was widely different than mine. And together we didn't overlook things. I would make a mistake and he or she would capture that mistake before it manifested. And so I began to realize the power of diversity of thinking. It has nothing to do with any other immutable characteristics that society tends to value these days when they talk about diversity. The only thing that matters to me is diversity of thinking, because we can reach a transcendent solution because we're looking at it from different aspects. That's my practical experience saying that why diversity of thinking is so important. I think to answer your more profound question, why is diversity of thought not so pervasive? I think because it's comfortable being with someone who thinks like you do and agrees with you do. And it sometimes is a little more uncomfortable if somebody looks at something different. But, if you're in a dangerous business, you begin to value that kind of discomfort because ultimately it's going to save your life. And so I think the same thing happens in organizations that aren't talking about life or death. It's going to make you more successful if you have diversity of thinking. And even politics, and we won't go there, but the same thing. If you have diversity of thinking, you're going to achieve a better societal answer.
Yeah, I mean, not to tackle the loaded question of the human nature and the tribalism that's deeply seated in our genetics as well, because otherism or tribalism implies that there's a tribe, and it's only a tribe when there's a perceived common enemy. That's a very common tactic used by extremist communities for like brainwashing, things like that. Identify a common enemy, because I interviewed a former CIA recently, and that's what they do. That's propaganda tactics. But that aside, it just hit me now, actually, Jim, where if you really, really dissect and go deep into the root of racism, otherism, whatever ism, is a lack of diversity of thinking. Based on your references and your operational thinking, they look different, therefore X, Y, and Z. Their skin color, their sex and gender is different, therefore X, Y, and Z. Sure, on the surface, it's the color, the skin pigmentations we're born with. But if you really dig deep, it's because they don't fit into your references of the world based on your comfortability. And I think we really need to have more conversations about diversity of thinking.
Yeah. Can I give you one more example? As you were talking, this came to mind. We're about ready to launch the first crew to the moon since 1972.
Oof.
The crew's already been assigned, and organizations are making a big deal out of the fact that we have the first woman and the first person of color going around the moon. But that's all they say. And here's my example. I had 2 personal one-on-one conversations with Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. I flew with Eileen Collins, the first woman pilot at NASA, who became the first woman commander of a space shuttle mission at NASA. I worked with Sally Ride the whole time she was in the office until she left before I did. And I flew with Peggy Whitson, who was the first chief of the astronaut office. I flew with her in space. All 4 of these people had 3 things in common. They were the first at what they did, but they had these 3 things in common. Number 1, they were really good and they deserved to be in those positions because they were the best choices to fulfill that mission. Number 2, they understood the importance of being a role model and inspiring people, and they did that job really well. But number 3, they really wanted to be known for number 1, that they were the best at what they did, that they were chosen for that mission because they were the best choice. And that's what I think we should be focusing on. You know, when we talk about Christina Heck and Victor Glover, who are going to fly around the moon, I don't care that it's a female and a person of color. It's because they are the best choice. They are world-class experts at what they do. They're the best operators. There's no one better to be on that mission than they are. That's the way I think about it.
I mean, once again, it's slippery slope, but like the idea that identity, like I said, I do have a former policy background, so I'm very well versed in politics. I choose not to engage because cancel culture is very real. But like identity politics were originated out of good intention to spotlight the marginalized communities. But then after a while, through iteration, it actually diminishes the multifaceted nature of who we are. Once you label someone as a pervasive label, that label overshadows anything else.
That's exactly right.
And that's why I'm really big on, like, yes, we went through a phase of diversity of ethnicities, race, gender equality. Of course, those are immutable characteristics you talked about. Like just being fairness, justice, like equality, of course, who disagrees with that? But I think now we have overcorrected, and I think society does oscillate pretty extremely just based on the patterns of our society that we live in. But I do hope that one day we as a society, and I think this is how we bypass the polarity that we live in, this chasmic divide in America, is have more conversations, have the confidence about your unique skill sets, but have the humility to be willing to be curious and have an open conversation. And I think through this, we can be more inviting of other people's thoughts, other people's references, their thoughts, processes, and integrate. Because like we are the same species, right? And there's so many bigger things to worry about than all these like little things I think society is losing its focus over.
Yeah. Great. I love it.
Yeah. But before this conversation goes towards a different direction, and I want to be respectful of your time. This was an awesome conversation. I have one mission, speaking of mission statements, for all my preparation. Aside from having a great conversations, providing listeners with the value, those are given, obviously. I always ask myself how much through lines and intersectionalities I can create on the podcast with the guest's expertise and my expertise of psychology. And I honestly didn't know how much I could connect because space, aerospace, astronaut. But I think talking to you, and I know you've been interested in brain functioning since you're 10, and you wanted to be an astronaut since you're 10. But this was an amazing, amazing conversation. And I really appreciate your thoughtfulness, your expertise, and your contribution. I mean, just some of the figures you named 5 minutes ago, like you're a real historical piece, and you've done a lot for the history of the NASA and space flight. So I really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you very much, Benoit. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope it helps and is beneficial to your listeners. I assume it will be because your questions were great, and I love the conversation. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Before we close out and roll out the metaphorical red carpet, is there anything that you felt like you haven't touched upon? Anything you want to project onto a massive messaging board for the audiences?
I don't I think so. I think we've covered a lot. Take control of your own life and control the risk, and you'll have a much happier life.
Well said. So where can people find your book? Anything else you have to offer, Jim?
Yeah, I guess it's available just about anywhere. Amazon is where most people go. I do have a couple of copies. I need to buy more. I do like to autograph them for folks. People seem to like that. So that's kind of fun, but they can probably order it just about anywhere.
I do believe that if you get it from your website, it comes with autograph guaranteed.
Yes. Right now, I think it's disabled because I don't have enough copies and I don't want to suddenly get 500 people requesting it, and I only have a handful of books. I need to order more and get the website going.
Yeah. No, but hey, definitely recommend checking out Jim's book. I mean, his knowledge in this and his expertise it's very, very clear from this conversation. So to all the listeners, one last favor before you leave. If you discover something that improved your life, allowed you to gain more sense of control in your life, I want to ask you to share this episode with one friend. One friend only is free for you, but very helpful for the podcast's growth. And as always, I'll link Jim's information in the show notes below. And I encourage you to choose love over fear and curiosity over judgment in the next week's train of Discover More. Thank you for tuning in.